Did you know we put enough concrete and steel in the ground burying the dead every year to build a new Golden Gate Bridge?
Whoa, I had no idea. You're living your whole life trying to be green, but how many of us actually think about the impact we have on the planet when we die?
What do you do when your end is near? Exiting gracefully with a lighter footprint today on the Growth Busters podcast.
Calling. Call the Growth Busters. Whoa.
Welcome to the Growth Busters podcast, where we're sharing our journey to sustainability. On a full planet, it's time we stop expanding the scale of the human enterprise. We're talking about both our numbers and our consumption habits. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters Hooked on Growth. For cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org. My partner in growth busting, Erica Arias, is in the building.
Hi, Dave.
Hey, glad you could join me for this part of the episode, but sorry that we won't have you during the conversation.
I missed out.
Yes, you did. But imagine having this conversation at the funeral home when a loved one has passed away. Paper or plastic?
No, thank you. I brought my own bag.
Did you know that you can shrink the footprint of a funeral by just throwing mom into a burlap bag and burying her in the backyard?
Is that mom's only option?
No. In fact, it turns out that there are quite a few options. But that option actually is possible in many places. And that's just one of the many surprises that greeted me when I had the conversation that we're about to share with you. Green burial wasn't really on my top 10 list of topics to tackle, but when I ran across the Green Reaper, Elizabeth Fournier, I just had to talk to her. Elizabeth has been a mortician for 29 years. She runs a one-woman funeral service in the town of Boring, Oregon. Can you believe there's a town called Boring, Oregon?
I'll have to visit when I'm visiting Oregon this weekend.
I think it's not to be missed, especially when you want to take a nap.
Wonderful.
Anyway, Elizabeth wrote the book, The Green Burial Guidebook, everything you need to plan an affordable, environmentally friendly burial. So I had a chat with her, and I had that chat over a year ago, and somehow we just got distracted and kept putting off getting this episode published, which is a real shame because Elizabeth is really smart and delightful. So finally, we're getting around to it. With apologies to Elizabeth, this is a really great conversation. Sorry you had to miss it, Erica, but I know that you will enjoy hearing it.
Great. Well, let's play.
Okay, here we go. Here's my chat. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining me today. I think the way we end our lives, burial, funerals, whatever you want to call it, is something that most people don't give much thought to in terms of how ecologically responsible they are or how green they are. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I think that's really fair. We're definitely focused on the loss of that human. We're also focused on now we have our grief and what are we going to do? And I think maybe, monetary spending and all takes a role as far as tradition, religion, all of those pieces as well. But now we're realizing that the environment is also a pretty grand part of that puzzle.
Sure. Those are all valid considerations, but I'm hoping our conversation today can help people think, wow, I hadn't really thought about that. We might consider the impact of what we're doing.
Yeah.
And you have been, I guess, pioneering in that area.
I'm one of the people. There's definitely others out there, which is so fantastic to be able to report. There's a lot of eco-minded funeral directors and home funeral people and casket makers and just a big slew of us now that are realizing that since we recycle and we clean hiking trails and we really take care of life while we're above ground, maybe as we go into the next step of the after death area, maybe we need to consider being the same way.
Now, at the risk of being a little bit grim here, I want to say that actually dying is one of the greenest things we can do, because if I kick the bucket this afternoon, then as of tomorrow, I don't have a carbon footprint or much of a carbon footprint anymore. I'm not driving a car. I'm not getting on any airplanes. I'm not watching television, using electricity. But just the very nature of my burial or whatever you call it, is there some kind of an overarching term that, because we're going to be talking about things beyond burial, what's the term we use to just describe everything we do about end of life?
Well, would that be end of life care? Would that be it? Or would it be afterlife care? I think we've called it the funeral industry for so many years, but now we're realizing it's more maybe death care, which is really, love is a huge central focus of that.
So before we get into some of the options, why do we need to think about the impact of how we end our life? Can you share with us a little bit about some of the impacts of traditional burial?
Yeah, one reason we really need to think about this is even though science and technology has amassed and is such a great thing, 100% of us are going to die. The mortality rate is just there, and it's something we're all going to face. Those in our life are going to be there as well. And so the modern burial industry has progressed in the sense where we have all of these options and all of these things we can do. But for the pocketbook and as well as the environment, it certainly has regressed because we are spending an exorbitant a bunch of cash to really kind of damage our planet, which isn't the best idea. That black mark we're leaving for future generations isn't so good. An example of that is, did you know that we bury enough metal and steel and concrete in the ground that we could be rebuilding a Golden Gate Bridge annually?
My goodness.
That's pretty amazing to think about, isn't it? Rather than having that above ground where people on the planet could be using that, it's buried and it's really not doing anything.
Well, why do we do that? Because we want to keep the bugs away, right?
Well, the funeral industry has told us that's what we need to do. We need to buy this beautiful casket because we loved our loved one, and we need to allow them to be in this luxurious, lacquered, or a beautified piece of equipment. And then we need to go ahead and have our loved one embalmed and have them look lifelike. We need to spend a lot of money on a service. We need to go into a pristine burial park, which has been procured with chemicals and looks sparkling green for the afterlife. And that's what we need to do if we love somebody. Where we are now is we're heading in the direction where we're realizing, wait a minute, that doesn't signify love. Your wallet and the expense you're paying out and the things that you're choosing at the funeral home isn't really cutting it. There isn't much of a heart-centered piece there. So we're finding out through, of course, studies of these things with chemicals and with resources, fossil fuels, all this, that we haven't been making the best choices. And there's a way to really simplify this and go back to what we all did 150 years ago, which was have a basic, simple, natural burial.
Yeah, there's this circle of life. And certainly anyone who's trying to live sustainably understands the cycles of life and recycling and reusing. And it kind of flies in the face of that to think that every human created needs to end up being somehow preserved for as long as possible in all that steel and concrete, instead of being returned to nature to fertilize trees and ferns, right?
That's totally right. Yeah, it's really the circle of life. And it's that idea that you still can have your loved one dressed in a favorite outfit, and we still can go ahead and have some sort of a burial container. We still can have a ceremony. We still can eat food and memorialize them either with prayers or special words. And the human life does matter. It's good to take a moment and to reflect and to visit with them or bathe them or do whatever you need to do. But we don't have to spend such a magnitude of money to get there, and nor do we need to buy all of these goods and services that ultimately aren't doing anything for the future of the planet. The human body is amazing, and there's no laws that state you need to be embalmed to be buried in a cemetery or in somebody's backyard. So people are just starting to awaken to this and realize that this is something that doesn't have to be done. You still can have a visitation. Your loved one still can look very peaceful and slumberous when they're laid to rest. And we're just realizing consumers can ask questions. They can make their own caskets. They can use a sheet that's been on the bed for a shroud. There's all these ways we can be very hands-on. That whole do-it-yourself, the DIY culture is really taking hold. And it's really pretty fascinating to see people empower themselves and really take care of their own loved ones.
Wait a minute. Are you saying I can just bury mom in the backyard?
Well, it depends where you live, but here's the thing. Green burial is legal in all 50 states. Now, each state decides specifically where green burials can happen. As an example, I happen to be in the great state of Oregon. How the laws read here is the statutes say it really is up to each county to decide what they want to do. I happen to be in a county that says, fantastic, as long as you're in the rural county, as long as you have at least 1 acre, you're away from a watershed or power structure, you can go ahead and do this. And you would just be amazed at the amount of people who say, okay, sounds good to me. Why not? Rather than spend $3,000 to buy a cemetery space down the street, why not go ahead and use this wonderful yard where mom tended to her flowers, and we've had this house in the family for a generation, and I don't see us moving anytime soon, and this just seems really hands-on and fantastic, and people kind of get a kick out of it. They really find this to be something that not only will be nutritious to the soil, but also kind of delicious mentally to that idea of, wow, we really can take care of our loved one like they did back in the pioneer days before people told us there's all these rules and regulations. So it's really wonderful to see the eyes open and for people to learn that a lot of places say, yep, this is something you can do. We just don't advertise it.
And I believe you mentioned that we do not have to use all these chemicals to preserve a body just to have a viewing.
Right. Now, every state, again, has its own rules. A wonderful place to look for these rules is the National Home Funeral Alliance website. They've done a great job breaking it down state by state to let you know which states you're allowed to transport your loved one yourself, which states you can do certain things. And in a lot of states, they say you can have a public visitation without somebody being embalmed. Of course, embalming comes in with specific circumstances. You know, if somebody's had a full autopsy, sometimes it's helpful for this to happen. If you're, traveling a great distance and maybe air conditioning or dried ice might not work for your situation. I mean, it definitely has its purpose, but it isn't something you need to do readily. When families come into me and they're going to have a simple direct cremation for their loved ones, a lot of people say, now, she doesn't need to be embalmed first, does she? So it's just the lack of education of the public that this is a preservation method that more and more is sort of going by the wayside, and it's really something that does not need to be chosen by the family.
Elizabeth, when a family comes in to talk to you about doing one of these green burials, do we have some kind of a hang-up about preserving the body rather than letting the body return to nature quickly and naturally?
Well, I think first off, this is somebody that you loved who'd passed away, and people want their loved one to be treated as best as possible. And sometimes people don't know exactly what that looks like or what it is. And quite frankly, most people don't want to think about it, which I completely understand. So my job as a funeral director is to provide some options, not be overwhelming. But if a family does say they've heard of this natural burial thing, or they would like to see if maybe they can go to the fabric store and get some material and make a shroud, we can go from there. Refrigeration is another tool that we use rather than embalming, and that stops the body from decomposing, if you will. A lot of families decide that they want to have their loved one at home, and they either want to forego using a funeral home, which again is legal in all states but about 10, or you want to just have your loved one at home for a little while. There's ways, again, that a body can be preserved. Your body inherently, from the moment you pass away, its job is ultimately to break down and go back into nature. But this doesn't happen automatically. There's some factors that make it happen quicker, such as weight. If the person unfortunately has so much chemotherapy and the radiation inside them, if it's a really, really hot season out there. But traditionally, most families are pretty pleased to know that they can have their loved one at home for a couple days, or they can have a visitation without embalming, and it just looks like mom or dad or grandma are just peacefully sleeping.
So it's a little bit complicated to know what the laws are in your area and what you can and what you can't do. So it almost feels like even if you're not required to use a funeral director, are there other sources of information, or does it turn out if you find a green burial specialist in your area, that's probably the best way to go to get good information and advice?
Well, I actually just wrote a book recently. It's called the Green Burial Guidebook. And what pushed me to write this book was I was spending a lot of time with families, instructing them and giving information. Local funeral homes were calling me to gather information. I was writing a lot of articles, and people started saying to me, can you just compile all this into one place? Can you either dedicate a website or make a brochure or write a book or something, because there's nothing out there which helps families step by step. There's books that talk about the anthropology and why we should do this and why it's good for the environment, but no one's helping us make the steps. So in my book, it breaks down which states allow you to do what. It also breaks down all of the cemeteries in all of the states, so you know where you can have a natural burial. And for those who don't quite know what we're talking about, a natural burial or a green burial are both the same thing. And it really means that you're going to have a body which hasn't been embalmed. That body isn't placed in a metal casket or some sort of wood casket with lots of lacquer and shellac. And then that casket isn't buried in a grave space where it's surrounded by a concrete or a steel grave liner for preservation. All of those three levels of hazardous materials, basically, that get in the way of a body returning to the earth aren't there. You still can bring your loved one into a church. You still can have a visitation. You still can have a box that looks just like a traditional casket. You still can go to a standard cemetery, which has natural burial spaces. All of these things still can happen. So there isn't the barrier of, well, I don't have a yard which would allow me to do this, or, yeah, but, grandma really wants to go into the Catholic Church and I can't quite do that. Everything can be done naturally. Green burial is out there for anybody who has any interest.
But there are a few hurdles to get over. So can you clarify for me, you can't necessarily have a natural burial in any cemetery. Some cemeteries won't allow that.
Exactly. So there are cemeteries which have been just made for natural burial. They're called natural burial preserves, and a lot of states have them. Some places like New York have several of them. You can look around. There's websites which give this information too. The Green Burial Council website is a fantastic place that will let you know which funeral homes and cemeteries will help you with green burial. They go out and they vet these places and also regulate them. So that's been a great resource for most people. And there's a lot of traditionally standard cemeteries out there that have said, yeah, okay, if you want to buy a grave space in the cemetery, you don't have to have a burial liner. And that's really what specifies a cemetery to allow natural burial. It just says you don't have to have a grave liner, which would be a simple concrete box which is placed in the bottom of the grave, and the casket or the shroud is lowered into that. And the purpose of that piece of material is it acts like a box which the soil goes on top of. Therefore, the grave settles perfectly even, and you get that nice flush Memorial Park look. You don't get anything sinking. You don't have to do any extra backfilling of soil, all of those things. So that's what standard cemeteries have been using for years. They're getting away from that now and realizing if families not only don't want to spend the cost for that piece of material that you don't see because it's already inside the grave, but also they're realizing that having a natural space is more what they want to do to allow their loved one to go back to nature. So these places are all over. And what I have found is if you call a lot of small cemeteries that haven't had a burial in a while, they're so thrilled to have somebody want to use the cemetery that they're just thrilled you want to come and pay for a grave space and for someone to open and close it, that they'll forego the liner, which makes it a green burial.
Huh. Are you finding that more and more funeral homes are open to this, or will people find considerable amount of pushback if they just go to a funeral home without looking for someone who specializes in green or natural burials?
I think that there are more funeral directors that are really getting on board with this. What I tell families is if you even have an interest and want to ask questions about this and you call a funeral home or go into a funeral home and you do get the pushback, then you can always go to a different funeral home. That's simply it. There's many parlors in different places and they're all there to help you probably to the best of their ability. Some people just don't have knowledge of green burial, but there's lots of parlors out there that are able to help you with this. You just have to ask.
Now, Elizabeth, you wrote another book, didn't you? Not that long ago?
Yes.
The Green Reaper, Memoirs of an Eco-Mortician.
Right. So last year I wrote a book and it was my memoir, and that was about being a young woman very early on in life, knowing that this was my calling because I had a lot of deaths in my family home as a small child. They were all natural deaths, but nonetheless, they happened in a very short period of time. And I much stood out from a lot of the kids my age. I knew at 13 I wanted to go into the funerary arts. I didn't quite know what it looked like, but know that's what I wanted to do. And so the book is about being a young woman in my 20s, trying to go and find a job back in 1990 when there weren't really girls in funeral homes, and going through the gyrations of working for corporations and then finally being able to own my own funeral home out here in Boring, Oregon. Cornerstone Funeral Services just was in a repurposed goat barn. It was dilapidated, falling apart, and luckily that opportunity arose. So I wrote the book as inspiration for young women who were thinking that maybe this is what they want to do but didn't quite know how to get there.
Amazing. Now, what about all those people out there who don't think Oregon is so boring?
Well, it certainly isn't. I mean, we have one gas station. We've got the mom and pop place where I like to refill my soda. And of course, Cornerstone Funeral is here, which I've got a funny story about that, Dave. There's a lot of millennial kids that like to come by the funeral home because they think they're going to get a selfie with a sign that says boring funeral home. But I guess the joke's on them because it says Cornerstone.
That's pretty funny. Yep. I can't believe there really is a town called Boring.
There's a town called Dole, there's Weed, there's Needles. I mean, all across the United States has really, really wacky names. I see T-shirts occasionally, and, I never get enough boring Oregon jokes. I'm waiting for the one day someone gives me that fantastic zinger that really knocks me off my feet.
Now, my grandparents who lived in the panhandle of Texas, their best friends ran a funeral home, and their name was Boxwell. That was actually the last name of these people who owned the funeral home. So there you go. I guess they knew what their calling was. But I brought that book up because I wanted to ask you about, it wasn't being green that really got you into the business. That's not what drove you to choose this as a career path.
Yeah, early in the 70s when it was something that I wanted to do, and then got into it when I was, in college age. No, certainly the environment didn't play a forefront in most people's thinking at that point. Solely for me, it was wanting to help people. It was wanting to probably have my own closure, probably figure out a way to nurture my own grief, as well as I was so comfortable with cemeteries and funeral homes and funerals at that point. I, considered myself sort of a junior professional as I was helping friends bury their cats and say prayers for their goldfishes that died. And kids would come sit next to me in the cafeteria when a grandparent had passed away. So I just sort of knew that I'd put my time in for practice, so to speak, and somewhere this would be the right calling for me. Little did I know that it wasn't just the calling of being an undertaker, but after my very first green burial, I realized my calling is more profound than just being a funeral director. It's really bringing green burial and teaching people that literally going green should be our last heroic act of environmentalism. It's an amazing connection and amazing intimate services. These green burial services I have with families, I just find are just really, I can't even put a word around it. The families with the hands-on, they have so much closure and it's so healing for them. And just to be able to bear witness to that and be a part of that is just such an honor.
Changing the subject, even cremation actually is a pretty high-impact way to go, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Cremation is something that is becoming readily popular because of the fact people look at it like it's environmentally sound because you're not choosing a grave space. They also look at it like it's economically sound because, again, you're not buying a casket, you're not paying for all of these things, you just have a simple cremation. Well, studies are showing that the body that you're not putting into the ground, you're ultimately putting it into the ozone layer. All of the mercury in your teeth is going out around space and getting into our farmlands and getting eaten by the fishes and all of these terrible things. Also the fossil fuels, just to start up that afterburner up to the 1800 degrees used for a cremation to happen is becoming pretty costly here for us, not just fossil fuels, but just the chemicals going into the environment. So there are states now, there's about 12 in the United States that allow a water cremation, which is really neat. Oregon has this, and this is an environmentally carbon-friendly situation where we have a body which is going to be in pressurized water. It's some potassium chloride. It's a nice little water bath. Body breaks down to a skeleton. Skeleton goes down into sort of the powdery cremains, and you still get the same out product as you would with your standard cremation. You're going to get an urn with cremated remains. It's the same time frame as the high heat flame cremation, but it's a zero carbon footprint. And then the water that's left over, a lot of people have contracts that give this out to pig farmers or seed farmers. We have a guy locally who takes the water here with the machine in Portland, and he has a place called Herland Forest up in Washington, which is not just a burial park, but it's a burial forest. You can be buried amongst these beautiful, huge trees, and he uses this water in his little fertilizer machine, and he sprays it out to fertilize his trees. So if you think about that, your loved one is being cremated with water, and then that water left over is going to feed trees. That's amazing. Now that is the circle of life.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. Now, I love people who want to do this just because it is low impact and they're trying to live a low impact lifestyle. But certainly there are going to be some people out there who just don't want to spend megabucks on a traditional funeral. Let's put a number to it. What does a typical traditional funeral cost these days, and what would a family maybe invest in a green burial instead?
I would say if you were going to take care of a modern burial, which would be embalming, a nice, expensive casket, or even a standard casket, which is, well, they're marked up about 400% at funeral homes. You're going to have a package from there, and then you're going to go on to a cemetery where you bought a grave space with a grave liner and all of that. Oh, you're probably looking at $10,000, $12,000. Now, if you're going to take care of a natural burial or a traditional burial, I mean, the most inexpensive way to do that would be to take care of your loved one to the best of your ability, have a space in the backyard prepared, and go ahead and have your burial at home. I mean, that's going to be probably as least expensive as you can get. Otherwise, you can use a mom and pop funeral home, which, isn't run by a corporation, so their costs are probably pretty fair. And then you're going to buy a space at a local cemetery, which it depends on where you live and the prices of land. But you can have a green burial, take care of everything, probably $5,000 or less. So that's going to be significant. Where I am in the country, between my charges and then the local cemetery, you're looking at maybe $2,000, $3,000. So it's, pretty cost saving.
Yeah. Well, is there anything that you would like our audience to hear that we haven't already talked about?
Yeah, there's two things that I would really, really love to add. And one is, it is so hard when somebody leaves your life, and ultimately the best choice for you. If you can make it environmentally friendly, that's wonderful. If you need to follow along traditionally with what your family has always done, then go easy on yourself. If that's what needs to happen, consider shades of green. Consider if you can carpool to the cemetery. If rather than having family members or whomever use cut flowers, you can have potted plants or maybe succulents instead. You can do some ways to really bring some environmental value to the service if you need to go more of a modern burial or modern funerary route. And then I want to bring up an example of my father's funeral. My dear beloved daddy, who I was very, very close to, passed away recently. And even though he wanted to be in his favorite wool suit, and he wanted to go downtown to our cathedral and have his mass and have the blessing by the Monsignor and be in a wood casket that looks similar to my mother and be buried next to her in the Catholic cemetery, we had a green funeral, we had a green burial. So I think it's surprising for people to hear that you can do something religious, you can do something that looks standard, but it can be 100% natural.
That is just amazing.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be the burlap sack in the backyard. I mean, this could be something that, he had a wood casket that by the naked eye, you would assume this was a walnut box or something that was lacquered or what have you, but it wasn't. It was very plain and made but with dowels and non-toxic glue. And I mean, there's comforts of green out there for everybody. There's shades of green, and take a look around, ask questions. Call me at the funeral home. I'm here to help.
Well, I'm very sorry for your recent loss of your father, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. Even as a mortician, I grieve. And, I don't get bereavement leave at my job, which is highly ironic, isn't it?
Yeah,
When you're a small town undertaker in Boring, Oregon, you just have to soldier on.
Well, I'm just sorry that you're half a country away, because I would certainly want to have someone as caring as you helping me out when I lose a loved one.
Well, Dave, that's extremely sweet. What an honor to hear. And I just want the listeners to know, if they have any green questions whatsoever, I have a website that has information. They're also welcome at any time to call or ask a question. I get this from people in different countries who just want to ask something. And even though I'm not going to be their funeral provider, again, I'm here of service. My website is cornerstonefuneral.com. If you want to learn more about me or my book, you can look at thegreenreaper.org, and I'm here to serve.
And I'll have these links in the show notes too, so that you don't necessarily have to write them down if you're listening while you're riding the train or riding your bicycle, maybe, which isn't really safe.
Or digging a grave in the backyard. Who knows?
Yeah, there you go. Well, Elizabeth, thanks so much for sharing this enlightening topic with us. This wasn't on my list. I wouldn't have even thought of it. So you've really enlightened me in the process.
And I appreciate you being so open to hear about it, because I think people get a little bit nervous when a mortician wants to do some speaking. It doesn't always have to be so in your face and always be so scary. We can have a delightful conversation.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. So what are your thoughts about that, Erica?
This is also a topic that I've never even thought of before hearing this episode. So it was really a pleasure listening to Elizabeth, because just her personal story of how she got into this career. I can't think of anybody else who has spoken so passionately about it, but I think it's really cool because we really rarely ever think about death. And I think a lot of us think more so about what happens after we die, but not really the impact that we leave for our actual burial service. And it is a part of life. It's something that we will all eventually go through. So it was a really interesting topic.
Yeah, and these are my words, not hers, but she definitely brought up this thing that we have going too frequently, where we're reluctant to be a little bit lower impact with a funeral, not because we're evaluating the impact, but we're evaluating the expenditure. And we don't want to be seen as a cheapskate.
Right. That loved one, you want to honor them in the best possible way. And that means going above and beyond, more flowers, more people attending the service. It all adds up.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to mean that. We tend to, I think of the wrong things, the most expensive casket, which turns out to be a really poor choice if you're trying to live lightly on the planet, for example. So I think it's a good idea to listen to this episode long before you need to plan a funeral for a loved one or plan your own funeral. There's a lot of distance between the decision making and the emotion that goes with having just lost somebody. And in fact, that way you could get their inclusion in the decision-making process and get their blessing to design an exit that has a much smaller footprint. And you can honor somebody in so many other better ways, including having a low footprint.
Yeah. I just really loved what she had to say about the water cremation. It's like you're giving back to the earth, and I love that so much.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I had this mistaken notion that cremation was probably a pretty green way to go.
Same.
But traditional cremation, not that green.
Not at all, no.
Well, I will remind you that we'll include links in the show notes to both of Elizabeth's books and some of the other resources that she mentioned. So if you are interested in researching this subject a little more, check out the show notes.
Great. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for enlightening us.
Yeah, and thanks for being so patient. And I'm glad that you haven't kicked the bucket waiting for us to get this episode. It just turned out that the Growth Busters episode about green burials was quite an undertaking.
I should have put this one at the top of the list, so this is my fault. Really great episode. I really very much enjoyed it. And who knows, maybe we'll invite you back next time.
Maybe so, but we're definitely both putting Boring, Oregon on our must-travel to itinerary. Okay, so don't forget to explore issues at growthbusters.org. Subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app. Costs you nothing. And by all means, share, because we really want to infect the entire planet with the desire and the knowledge to live sustainably. So until next time, live sustainably.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.